My name is Helen Parker, and I'm 58 years old. People often assume that when a woman loses her husband, she also loses her strength. They think grief makes you weak. They think loneliness makes you helpless. And after what happened to me, many people believed I was about to lose everything. Before I tell you my story, please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy emotional stories filled with shocking twists, family drama, and satisfying endings. Stories like mine remind us that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the quietest people are the strongest. 3 years ago, my husband, Thomas Parker, passed away unexpectedly after suffering a heart attack. Thomas and I had been married for 34 years. Together, we built a small construction company in Pennsylvania from nothing. In the early years, I handled paperwork while Thomas worked on job sites. We sacrificed vacations, worked weekends, and poured our lives into the business. By the time we reached our 50s, Parker Construction had become one of the most respected companies in our county. I believed our future was secure, but I was wrong. After Thomas died, I could barely function. For months, I struggled with grief, and during that painful period, I trusted the wrong people. Thomas's younger brother, Richard Parker, stepped forward and offered to help manage the company. "Don't worry, Helen," he told me. "Thomas would have wanted me to protect the business." At the time, I was grateful. I believed he genuinely cared. But slowly, strange things started happening. Financial reports disappeared. Employees I had known for years suddenly resigned. Bills arrived that I didn't recognize. And whenever I asked questions, Richard always had excuses. "You're under stress. You're grieving. Let me handle it." For almost a year, I believed him. Until one afternoon, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. I accidentally opened a letter addressed to the company. Inside was a document showing that Richard had secretly transferred several company assets into another corporation under his control. I couldn't believe my eyes. My own brother-in-law had betrayed me. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Instead, he smiled. A cold smile I'll never forget. "Helen," he said calmly, "you don't understand business." I stared at him in shock. "This company belongs to Thomas and me." He laughed. "No, Helen, this company belonged to Thomas." Then he delivered words that shattered my heart. "And Thomas is gone." I felt physically sick. "How could you do this?" Richard shrugged. "Because someone has to be realistic." Then his wife, Susan, entered the room. She looked at me with pity. "Helen, maybe it's time to let go." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 34 years of sacrifice. Gone. Just like that. Then Susan laughed softly and said the sentence I will never forget. "Besides, everyone knows you can't afford a legal battle," Richard smirked. "Exactly. Good lawyers cost money. And everyone knows you're broke. That word echoed inside my mind. They believed grief had destroyed me. They believed I was weak. And worst of all, they believed I would surrender. But what neither of them knew was that Thomas Parker had prepared for situations like this, and hidden inside my late husband's office was something that would change everything. I didn't sleep that night. After Richard and Susan left, I sat alone in my living room staring at the old photograph hanging above the fireplace. It was taken 20 years earlier. Thomas was smiling. I was standing beside him, and behind us stood the very company we had built together. Parker Construction, our dream, our sacrifice, our legacy. As tears rolled down my face, I whispered the same question over and over again. "Why, Thomas? Why would your own brother do this to us?" For several minutes, I simply sat there in silence. Then suddenly, I remembered something. About 6 months before Thomas passed away, he had become strangely serious one evening. I still remembered his exact words. "Helen, promise me something." I laughed. "Why are you acting like you're writing a movie?" But Thomas wasn't smiling. "I'm serious. If anything ever happens to me, never trust paperwork at face value." At the time, I thought he was simply being overly cautious. But now, those words suddenly meant something different. I immediately stood up. For the first time in almost 3 years, I entered Thomas's office. After his funeral, I had practically closed the room and avoided it completely. Everything inside still looked the same. His books, his desk, his reading glasses, even his favorite coffee mug. The sight broke my heart. For a few moments, I couldn't stop crying. But then I remembered why I had entered the room. Slowly, I opened his desk drawers. Nothing. Old receipts, business cards, family photographs, nothing unusual. Until I discovered a small key taped underneath the bottom drawer. My hands began shaking. I had never seen that key before. Immediately, I searched the room. And then I noticed something strange. Behind a framed photograph hanging on the wall was a tiny hidden safe. My heart started pounding. I inserted the key. Click. The safe opened. Inside was a thick envelope, and on the front, written in Thomas's handwriting, were 6 words that instantly made me cry. For Helen, if you ever need this. I sat down and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. My beautiful Helen, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. And if something has gone wrong, then I need you to remember something. You are stronger than you think. Never let grief convince you that you're powerless. And most importantly, do not blindly trust everyone around you. Not even family. Love does not guarantee honesty. People change when money becomes involved. Tears blurred my vision. It felt as though Thomas was sitting beside me again. Then I noticed another document inside the envelope. A confidential file. As I opened it, my entire body froze. It contained copies of ownership agreements, company records, bank statements, and something even more shocking, a signed statement written by Thomas himself. In that document, Thomas explained that several years earlier he had discovered questionable financial behavior involving Richard. Instead of confronting him publicly, Thomas had quietly protected the company by creating legal safeguards. Safeguards I never knew existed. And at the very bottom of the file was the name of a person I had never met. Attorney Daniel Carter. Beside his name, Thomas had written, "If Richard ever tries to steal from you, call Daniel immediately." I stared at the paper in disbelief. Thomas knew. Years before his death. Thomas already knew his own brother couldn't be trusted. Suddenly my phone rang. It was my friend Martha. After hearing everything, she sounded worried. "Helen, are you going to hire a lawyer?" I laughed bitterly. With what money? The truth was simple. After Thomas's death, medical expenses and business problems had drained most of my savings. Martha remained silent for a moment. Then she quietly said, "Helen, maybe Richard is right." I felt my heart sink. "What do you mean? Hiring lawyers costs a fortune. Maybe you should just settle. Settle. Give up. Lose everything Thomas and I spent 34 years building? No, absolutely not." That evening, I gathered every document Thomas had left behind and dialed the number written on the file. To my surprise, the phone was answered immediately. "Law offices of Daniel Carter." My voice trembled. "My name is Helen Parker." There was silence on the line. Then the receptionist asked softly, "Are you Mrs. Thomas Parker?" "Yes." Another pause. Then she said words I never expected to hear. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Carter has been waiting for your call for 3 years." My entire body froze. Waiting? How could that be? Then she continued. "Mr. Parker made arrangements before his passing. Mr. Carter told us that if you ever called, you were to be scheduled immediately." I couldn't breathe. Thomas had planned even this. 2 days later, I entered Daniel Carter's office carrying nothing but hope. And when I finally met him, he smiled warmly and said, "Mrs. Parker, your husband loved you very much, and before he died, he made sure you would never fight this battle alone." But I still had no idea what Thomas had done. And when Daniel finally revealed the truth, I realized Richard had made the biggest mistake of his life for the first time in months. I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. As I sat inside Daniel Carter's office, I expected him to review my documents and explain how expensive the legal process would be. Instead, he surprised me immediately. He stood up, shook my hand warmly, and said, Before we discuss business, I want you to know something. Your husband spoke about you often. I looked at him with confusion. You knew Thomas personally? Daniel smiled. For almost 20 years. He wasn't just my client. He was my friend. Hearing that nearly brought me to tears. Got toward a cabinet and removed an old folder. The name Thomas Parker was written across the front. This file has been waiting for you, he said softly. I couldn't understand. Waiting for me? He nodded. 3 years ago, when Thomas became seriously ill, he visited me. My heart immediately sank. Thomas had never told me how worried he truly was. Daniel continued. He told me something I'll never forget. Then Daniel opened the folder and read directly from his notes. If anything happens to me, my wife will try to handle everything alone. Please don't let that happen. Tears rolled down my cheeks. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Always thinking about me. Always protecting me. Daniel continued reading. Helen is stronger than she realizes, but grief makes people vulnerable. And if my brother Richard ever betrays her, promise me you'll help her fight. I covered my mouth and began crying. Even after death, Thomas was still protecting me. Daniel handed me a tissue. Your husband loved you deeply. Then he smiled. And before you ask. No, you're not paying me. I stared at him. What? He laughed softly. Thomas already took care of everything. I blinked in disbelief. What do you mean? Daniel opened another document. 3 years earlier, Thomas had prepaid every legal expense, every consultation, every filing fee, every hour. Everything. I couldn't speak. Richard had mocked me. Susan had laughed at me. Everyone assumed I couldn't afford a lawyer. But Thomas had already prepared for the worst. Daniel leaned forward. Helen, your husband knew exactly what kind of people greed creates, and he made sure you'd never face them alone. For the next several weeks, Daniel and his legal team investigated Parker Construction. What they discovered shocked even him. Richard hadn't simply transferred assets. He had forged signatures, hidden company income, created fake invoices, and illegally moved money through shell corporations. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Daniel smiled one afternoon. Helen, your brother-in-law isn't just unethical. He's careless. Then came the day Richard officially filed papers claiming ownership. Apparently, he believed I would panic and accept a settlement. Instead, Daniel filed a lawsuit. Within 24 hours, Richard called me. For the first time in months, he sounded nervous. Helen, maybe we should talk. I smiled. We are talking. Through my attorney. There was silence. Then he laughed. Attorney? Helen, stop pretending. You can't afford a lawyer, I quietly replied. Can I not? And I hung up. 3 weeks later, the case reached court. That morning, I arrived early. Richard and Susan were already there. The moment they saw me sitting alone, Susan smirked. Poor Helen, Richard laughed. She's probably representing herself. His expensive attorney stood beside him looking confident. Then Richard walked over and whispered, Last chance. Sign the settlement. You'll lose anyway. I simply smiled. No, he laughed. Helen, reality is expensive. You don't have the money to fight me. Those exact words would soon haunt him. 10 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened, and every head turned. A tall man in a navy suit entered carrying several boxes filled with documents. Daniel Carter. Behind him walked 2 associates, and behind them, a forensic accountant. Richard's smile disappeared immediately. His attorney frowned. Susan looked confused. Then Daniel calmly walked toward me. Good morning, Mrs. Parker. He placed the files on the table. Then he turned toward Richard and smiled politely. Good morning. Richard looked pale. You hired Daniel Carter? Even his own lawyer looked concerned. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just any attorney, he was one of the most respected corporate litigators in Pennsylvania. Suddenly, Richard's confidence vanished. For the first time since Thomas died, I watched fear appear in his eyes, and I realized something beautiful. People who bully others often depend on one thing. They assume their victims are powerless. But the moment power shifts, everything changes. As the judge entered the courtroom, Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "Relax, Helen. Today we're simply telling the truth." But neither Richard nor Susan had any idea how much truth Daniel was about to reveal, and by the time the hearing ended, their entire world would collapse. The judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose to their feet. I sat down slowly, trying to calm my nerves. Despite Daniel's confidence, I was terrified. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about the company anymore. It was about Thomas. It was about 34 years of sacrifice. It was about protecting the life we had built together. Across the room, Richard still tried to appear confident, but I could see the fear behind his eyes. For the first time since Thomas died, he wasn't dealing with a grieving widow. He was dealing with facts. And facts don't have emotions, they don't get tired, and they don't lie. The hearing officially began. Richard's attorney spoke first. He confidently claimed that Richard had stepped in to save the company after Thomas's death. He painted himself as a loyal brother who had sacrificed his own time to keep Parker Construction alive. Listening to him felt surreal. If I hadn't lived through the betrayal myself, I almost would have believed him. Then Daniel stood up. Calm, professional, composed. No drama, no anger, just confidence. "Your Honor," he began. "The opposing counsel has described Mr. Richard Parker as a man who rescued this company." He paused. Unfortunately, the documents tell a different story. The entire courtroom became silent. Daniel opened the first file. He presented financial records, then bank transfers, then corporate filings, one after another. Each document exposed another lie. Richard's attorney interrupted several times, but every objection was denied. Then Daniel presented evidence that made Richard visibly panic: forged signatures, fake vendor invoices, unauthorized asset transfers, even emails showing Richard discussing how quickly he could move ownership before I discovered the truth. Susan's face turned white. She had no idea. Or perhaps she had. Either way, the confidence she wore that morning had completely disappeared. The judge frowned. "This is extremely serious." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor, but we're not finished." Then he introduced the forensic accountant. For nearly an hour, the expert explained exactly how Richard had hidden money and manipulated records. The numbers were overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Assets hidden. Accounts disguised. Transactions deliberately concealed. Every explanation tightened the noose around Richard. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Daniel reached into his folder and removed a handwritten letter. Thomas's letter. The judge allowed it to be entered into evidence. Daniel looked toward me before reading it. "If anything happens to me, I fear my brother may place greed above family." Richard immediately stood up. "That's ridiculous." But the judge silenced him. Daniel continued. "My wife, Helen Parker, helped build this company from the very beginning. Everything we own belongs equally to her. If anyone ever attempts to take what we built together, I ask that she fight without fear." I couldn't stop crying. Neither could several people sitting behind me. Even the court reporter paused for a moment. Thomas's voice wasn't physically there, but somehow it felt like he was standing beside me, protecting me one final time. Richard looked completely broken. The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes. Then finally, she spoke. "The evidence clearly demonstrates fraudulent conduct." She turned toward Richard. "Mr. Parker, this court orders the immediate reversal of all unauthorized transfers." I closed my eyes. Tears streamed down my face. But the judge wasn't finished. She continued. "The matter of criminal misconduct will be referred for further investigation." Richard's face lost all color. Susan burst into tears. And just like that, everything they had tried to steal disappeared. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Daniel. But he refused every interview. Instead, he walked over to me and smiled. "Helen, we kept our promise, not his promise. Not my promise, our promise. Thomas's promise." Months later, Parker Construction slowly recovered. Several former employees returned. Clients who had left came back. And for the first time in years, I entered Thomas's office without crying. His photograph back on the desk and whispered, "We did it." A few weeks later, I received a letter from Richard. Not an excuse, not a defense, an apology. He admitted that greed had consumed him after Thomas died. He admitted that he had convinced himself he deserved more. I never responded. Not because I hated him, but because some wounds don't need conversations. They need distance. Today, at 58 years old, I no longer see myself as a victim. I see myself as a survivor. People thought I was broke. People thought I was weak. People thought I would surrender. But they forgot something important. A loving husband leaves behind more than memories. Sometimes, he leaves behind protection. And sometimes, the people who underestimate you become the authors of their own downfall. So if someone has ever mistaken your kindness for weakness, remember this. Being quiet does not mean being powerless. And just because someone thinks you've lost everything doesn't mean they know the whole story. Because sometimes, the greatest comeback begins when everyone believes you've already lost. The end. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories filled with drama, justice, and unforgettable endings.